My name is Gabriella Byron, and my co-host here is Corey Helm. On behalf of Cinema Politica Toronto-Danforth, Etobicoke-Lakeshore NDP, and Toronto East Residents for Renewable Energy, we are pleased to welcome you to this really important discussion on Ontario's energy future. Ontario is at an energy crossroad. Decisions being made right now, such as the third transmission line to bring nuclear energy to Toronto and the development of small modular nuclear reactors, will determine our energy options for decades to come. We believe that in the rush to expand nuclear and fossil fuel-based electricity, the alternative, specifically sustainable renewable options such as solar, wind, and hydro, are not being adequately considered, if they're being considered at all. We'll explore these options this evening with an outstanding panel of experts, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to learn and discuss more about what our real options are here. But before we begin, I'd like to pass the word to David Langell to do the land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We want to begin by honoring the land on which we live and the nations who've been stewards of this place since time immemorial. As you know, the City of Toronto is on the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territories of many nations, including the Chippewa, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. These territories are covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with the Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Today, Toronto is home to many First Nations, Inuit and Métis nations, and we recognize and uphold Indigenous peoples and their nation's right to self-determination, jurisdiction, and justice. The choices you're going to hear tonight will affect First Nations throughout the province. Let us remind you that in working towards agreements, prior informed consent is required, not simply consultation. You will hear more about this, especially from Michael Thunderbird. National Truth and Reconciliation Day is coming up on September 30th. Please take the time tonight and afterwards to think about concrete actions that you can take to learn more about Indigenous nations' struggles for justice and foster meaningful relationships with the Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Just a few words about who we are for those who are joining us for the first time. Cinema Politica is an outreach program of Toronto-Danforth NDP Writing Association. And as the name suggests, we ran monthly films, documentary films, to inform and spark discussion and action on key issues facing us. Well, until COVID came along and made us look for some new approach. Like many, we quickly discovered Zoom and moved into a webinar format. And to date, we've held about this, I think this is our 14th webinar panel on important issues. And along the way, we were joined by Etobicoke-Lakeshore. Most of these panels were recorded and some are still available on the Toronto-Danforth Cinema Politica Toronto-Danforth Facebook page if you want to look for them. And I'll just pass it over to Corey, who's a founding member of our partner for this event, Toronto East Residents for Renewable Energy.
Thanks so much, Gabby, and welcome everyone. On behalf of TERRE, I'd like to welcome you to this evening and to an evening of learning together. Toronto East Residents for Renewable Energy, or TERRE, is a nonpartisan coalition of East End residents and local climate justice groups working together to demand a phase out of the polluting Portland's Energy Centre by 2030. TERRE was founded in November of 2023 as a response to the Ford government's plans to expand the Portland's gas plant and continue ramping up the use of methane-fired electricity production across Ontario. TERRE is committed to supporting a rapid, just transition to renewable energy in Toronto and across the province. As we will hear about more tonight, the Ford government's energy policy is extremely short-sighted and is being driven by corporate interests. They are gambling with our future by investing in unproven, costly, and waste-producing small modular nuclear reactors that will not only take decades to build, but will also expand our reliance on polluting and costly methane gas. The government continues to ignore climate science, health experts, Indigenous communities, the voices of concerned local citizens, municipal governments, renewable energy experts, and others who are all saying that we must halt the use of fossil fuels as rapidly as possible and invest in proven, affordable, renewable energy sources like wind, solar, and battery storage. Rather than join the rest of the world in the transition to renewable energy, the Ford government is locking our province into methane gas and nuclear energy that we will all be paying for, both in terms of our climate, our health, and our money in the years and decades to come. It is more important now than ever that groups like TERRE and Cinema Politica and individuals like you continue to raise our voices and advocate for a rapid and just transition to renewable energy in Toronto and across Ontario. I invite you to find out more about our campaign and consider getting involved by visiting our TERRE website, which I will put shortly into the chat. And now I'm going to turn it over to Susan for some logistics.
Thanks, Corey and Gabriella. First, as those of you who were here when the recording started and anyone else who's joined after, the event is being recorded so that we'll be able to share it with you and with lots of others afterwards, as it's such an important subject. We are keeping everybody muted because of the kind of background noise that can happen if people can unmute themselves. And because of the number of people who we have participating, we're going to be asking you to share your questions or comments through the chat only. Our moderator, Paula Fletcher, will be going through the questions and comments, and we'll use those to help inform the discussion that she has with the panelists later on. Or, of course, if it's a question that can be answered by one of the panelists or by one of the organizers, they'll be able to put that in the chat. So feel free to make use of the chat for that purpose. We don't want to ask you to be too judicious about it because we want to make sure you have a chance to get all your thoughts out, but we do want Paula and others to be able to have a chance to go through it all. So take that into consideration as you put your comments and questions in. So finally, the format for the evening is that our great Toronto-Danforth City Councillor, Paula Fletcher, will be introducing each of the four panelists before they speak. Each one will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, which is not a lot of time for each to convey the important information they have, but that's why it'll be good for us to have the discussion. And that will be followed by a discussion among the panelists and questions from the chat room. Have a lovely rest of the evening. Thanks.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce our councillor, Paula Fletcher. As councillor for Ward 14 and previously Ward 30, Paula is a strong progressive voice at City Hall. She's focused on creating affordable housing, improving public transit, parks, and other public spaces, fighting the climate crisis, along with enhancing community and road safety for all users. Paula works with residents, community groups, local business owners to build vibrant, healthy neighborhoods. Paula, you have been a dedicated, tireless advocate for many years, and we're privileged to have you moderating tonight. Thank you, Paula. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Gabriella, and it's so great to be here tonight. And thank you for organizing this really important Zoom meeting for so many people. And there's many of you who are interested here. Just want to welcome everybody who's here because it's over 100 people here to talk about energy, to talk about renewables, to talk about really what's happening in our province. And we have such great guests that are going to bring you terrific information. Look forward to a really good chat when it's over. The Ford government is shifting everything, as you know. He likes to control everything, and the whole focus on renewable energy and alternatives and conservation has really been shifted to new form of energy or old form in a new way of nuclear. And we have always looked at the Portland's Energy Center. We want it closed down. They are going to repurpose that in a way that is not great. I also want to share that just even our landfill that the city owns, we had a project we've been working on for 5 years to capture the methane and create energy from that, which is a great project. And the Ontario Energy Board has said not interested. They're closing that down. So when the Ford government decides to shift, they really shift, and they are. So everybody who's here tonight to hear and be part of this discussion and really has an important role to play in trying to deal with that shift and pull it back and get back to what we all believe in, which is energy conservation, demand reduction, and of course, renewable energy. So I'm so happy tonight. We have such an incredible panel, and there's 4 of them. So you're going to get a lot of good info. We have Mark Winfield, who's a professor at York. We have Michael Thunderbird, who's from Long Plains First Nation, and he chairs the NDP Indigenous Peoples Committee. We have Angela Bishkoff, who of course is really well known and with the Clean Air Alliance, and we have our own MPP in Toronto-Danforth, I don't know how you say, indefatigable Energizer Bunny, Peter Tappan. So we're going to start off tonight with Mark Winfield, and I want to tell you a tiny little bit about Mark because he is a professor at York University, and he's a really, really well-known energy guy, conservationist, and he's a professor of environmental and urban change at York University. He co-chairs the faculty's Sustainable Energy Initiative and is coordinator of the Masters of Environmental Studies and Joint Juris Doctor MES program that's offered in conjunction with Osgoode Law School. Mark, you've written articles, you've written book chapters, you've reported on climate change, environment, and energy law and policy topics, and you are the co-editor of Sustainable Energy Transitions in Canada, which is published by UBC Press in 2023. So you are an extremely accomplished environmentalist who's really got your finger on the pulse, and we look forward to what you have to tell us tonight. So please, Mark, give us your overview of where you think we're going and what we need to do. Thank you so much for being part of this panel.
Great. Thanks, Paula. I'm going to go into a screen share if it's going to cooperate. Yes, it is. And then we will give this a second. This is always the tricky transition. Yeah. There we go. Get that out of the way. So as Paul said, I'm a professor at York University and also co-chair of the Sustainable Energy Initiative there. So the intention here is to get a bit of an overview of where we are in electricity and energy in Ontario as of September 2025. This is just an overview, particularly of the electricity system in terms of energy output, which at the moment is about 50% nuclear, 24% hydroelectric, which is legacy assets. 2 important numbers to keep an eye on. One is the portion of gas and oil generation, which has been rising dramatically in the past few years. And the better news is the substantial portion of generation from wind, although nowhere near what the potential could be. We've sort of now 7 years into the Ford era, and we kind of know where this started with the cancellation of 758 renewable energy projects, which were sort of the tail end of the Green Energy Act programs. The act itself was repealed. The province's energy conservation strategy was terminated. The entire climate change action plan was terminated. The requirements that there be any kind of formal planning process, a process which actually started been dismantled partially under the Wynne government and was basically completely eliminated by the Ford government. And of course, there was also a succession of offers from Quebec that we take some electricity off their hands, which were consistently rebuffed. The sort of current direction is laid out in these 2 documents, Power Ontario's Growth and Energy for Generations from last summer. The basic focus here is overwhelmingly on nuclear, a combination of refurbishments of existing facilities at Darlington, Bruce, and Pickering, and then proposals for new build capacity at Darlington. These would be the not so small and not really modular reactors. There is a proposal to add 4,500 megawatts of new capacity at Bruce, to proceed with the Pickering B refurbishment, which is 4 reactors, which have been previously assessed and determined to be uneconomic. And there's a proposal for 10,000 megawatts at Wesleyville, which I think even surprised Ontario Power Generation. My back of envelope estimate on the total capital cost here, based on what we know about refurbishments, the experience in other jurisdictions, notably the Vogtle project in Georgia, which is the only North American new build nuclear project in decades, the back of envelope estimate is somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 billion. And even by some estimates, that could be optimistic in terms of what the cost might be here. The other key theme is the growth and the role of gas-fired generation. We're already seeing this upward trajectory from about 4% back in 2017 up to 16%, and the projections are up to 25%, which is essentially the same portion of the system that coal was at the time the coal phase out began. So there's a very strong emphasis on gas and nuclear, and very, very little else. There was sort of a hint at a reopening on nuclear, on renewables, and then a pullback. It's not clear how this is actually going to play out because the rules were changed basically to allow for new gas capability and the same call for proposals. There has been some movement on grid energy storage, although exactly where that fits into the system is unclear. We've seen a feeble restart on conservation demand management, although also very significant constraints being put on the capacity of municipalities to engage in community energy planning and to work at that level. There has been quite a lot of attention to what are called distributed energy resources. This is rooftop solar, building level storage, potentially even doing things like wiring together fleets of parked EVs as grid storage. But this has really kind of been restrained to what they call at the Ontario Energy Board sandboxes. These are little pilot projects to play around with. And then there's that I think is sort of the major pieces. There have been some discussions around interconnections with Quebec and Manitoba, but certainly nothing very ambitious. And indeed, as I said, Quebec repeatedly made offers which were simply ignored by the Ford government. And there is a concern that to some degree, although how things are playing out in Quebec is its own complicated story, that ship may have sailed. The bottom line here is embedding rising costs and rising emissions in the sense that the nuclear heavy focus embeds very, very expensive supply down the road. And with the now quadrupling of the role of gas-fired generation, essentially the emissions of greenhouse gases and nitrogen oxides are going up more or less in lockstep with the increasing output from gas-fired generation. That all translates into increasing overall costs. It's not clear to me at all how this is all going to be paid for. And keeping in mind that now the nuclear program now constitutes as much as the government's previous estimate for its entire decarbonization strategy. And we continue to subsidize electricity rates from general revenues. That's money that otherwise would be going on things like schools and hospitals, to the tune, I think it's down a little bit this year, a little below $7 billion a year. So that there's sort of very conscious effort already to hide the actual costs of the pathway we're on. But it's not clear. I mean, I think we're kind of at the limit of that. So how all of this would actually get paid for at this stage is rather unclear to me. Interestingly, Ontario is probably the most modeled jurisdiction in terms of decarbonization pathways in Canada. It's not that we are short of ideas or indeed substantive research, including work from the IESO itself, in terms of what different pathways might look like, with much less emphasis on nuclear and much less emphasis on gas. The problem has been a complete reluctance on the part of the provincial government to pursue any of this. What we have had to some degree is a policy and planning vacuum into which the incumbents, principally on TERRE power generation and Bruce Power, keeping in mind that OPG is a major owner of gas-fired plant generating facilities as well as nuclear. They emerged very much looking like the winner in this, although I think even they were surprised by the Wesleyville proposal. And nobody else. I mean, there is no moderation here going on. I'm not going to talk about the federal role. We'll come back to that. It's a bit complicated, but the other crucial thing here is that there are loopholes built into the federal clean electricity regulations to allow for the growth of gas-fired generation in Ontario. And of course, the Darlington SMR project has been designated a nation-building project under Bill C-5, although what exactly that means is unclear. And we might come back to that in question and answer. So we are in a set of deepening challenges. All of the new reactor technologies are either unknown or unproven. We know they're not CANDUs. We know they're actually going to rely, unlike CANDUs, on enriched uranium fuel, which actually has to come from the United States, because we don't do uranium enrichment in Canada, which makes this a very strange pathway in terms of energy security. The costs on nuclear new build and to some degree refurbishments are, to put it politely, unknown. Although everything we learn is unencouraging in terms of costs. There is a very well-established record of delays and cost overruns. As I mentioned before, we don't know how this is going to be financed. It also introduces new types of waste fuel that will need to be managed. The entire NWMO process so far has assumed CANDU fuel, and we don't know what's going to come out of the non-CANDU type reactors we're dealing with. There remains no overall provincial strategy around decarbonization. Indeed, they've been very keen on expanding the gas grid. And at the same time, there's rapid technological development coming around the alternative technologies, particularly renewables, storage, distributed energy resources, microgrids, all coming together. So bottom line here, what we've got on the government side is kind of rational planning turned on its head, in the sense that they've focused very much on the highest cost, highest risk, highest impact options, nuclear and gas, and have basically marginalized everything else. If you were to look at this through a sustainability lens, you would look to maximize the role of lowest cost, lowest risk options first, and the higher cost options last, which means you would tend to optimize conservation demand management, distributed resource development, renewables and storage, optimize the role of interprovincial connections, avoid gas expansion. We're probably stuck with the Darlington and Bruce refurbishments at this stage, but any further nuclear expansion at best needs to be an option of last resort and subject to very, very, very high levels of scrutiny. As I say, this is exactly the opposite of what's happening. So where we go from here, I'll end on and leave it to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was incredibly insightful and a great presentation. I think we'll have lots of questions, and some are coming in the chat now, but you'll be able to give us a little more information on some of those pieces. I'm very pleased now to introduce Michael Thunderbird, and Michael is the co-chair of the ONDP Indigenous Peoples Committee, and you are founder of a great organization that partners with Toronto District School Board and others to teach Anishinaabe women to all ages. So I'm sure you can pronounce those a little better than me, and you'll help us with that. Thank you. You are very dedicated to language revitalization and Indigenous education, and I think you've got a lot of insights that you're able to share with us tonight about the impact of the shift in the Ford government on Indigenous communities throughout Ontario. So thank you, Michael, and welcome.
Thank you, Paula. I'm very honored to be here and share this panel here tonight with these wonderful people. When we talk about energy, we need to recognize that First Nations have had to shoulder the disproportionate burdens, often without consent and often with devastating consequences. Across Canada and the US, Indigenous peoples have seen their lands turned into sacrifice zones for oil, gas, and coal. We look to Alberta, the Athabasca Chippewa Nation and the Mikisew Cree Nation have been raising alarms for decades about the tar sands. Communities downstream face higher rates of rare cancers, toxic contamination of rivers, and destruction of traditional food sources, yet extraction continues at such a massive scale. Pipelines are another example. Here in Ontario, the Anishinaabe Nation has opposed projects like the Enbridge's Line 5, which runs under the Straits of Mackinac in Michigan and cuts through Anishinaabe territories. For years, First Nations on both sides of the borders have warned of catastrophic risks to the Great Lakes if Line 5 were to rupture. Despite this, governments have dragged their feet, prioritizing oil transport over Indigenous concerns and water protection. We look to Northern Ontario, with Anishinaabe Nation communities are living with the consequences of diesel dependence. Diesel spills have contaminated the soil and the water in these areas. The air pollution from the generators affects the health of the people there. And transporting fuel has proven to be expensive and dangerous, yet instead of fully supporting renewable alternatives, governments are now marketing nuclear, particularly the SMRs, the small modular reactors, as the solution, which in my opinion just shifts the risks rather than eliminating them. We take a visit to south of the border, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline, which became an international symbol of Indigenous resistance to fossil fuel expansion. The message was clear then, as clear as it is now, that Indigenous communities are tired of being forced to bear the environmental and cultural risks of energy projects that we've never asked for. When we turn to nuclear energy, the harms are just as real, though often hidden behind the talk of clean and green. The nuclear cycle begins, as we know, with the mining of uranium. When we look in Canada, uranium mines in northern Saskatchewan have produced wealth for the industry, but have left behind radioactive tailings and contaminated water. We look at the Dene and Cree workers that worked in these mines with little to no protection, and many have later suffered from cancers and early deaths, with the communities being rarely informed of the risks of working in these mines. We look in Quebec, the Cree Nation of Mitsinis fought to stop uranium mining in their territory. They knew the health and environmental dangers, and in 2015, Quebec imposed a moratorium. But it shouldn't have taken years of Cree advocacy for governments to acknowledge these risks. And again, in the United States, we look at the Navajo Nation, which offers one of the starkest examples. From the 1940s to the 1980s, uranium mines left behind over 500 abandoned sites. Workers who were often Navajo men were exposed to radiation without being told of the dangers, and the families used contaminated water and materials in their homes. And generations later, Navajo communities are still dealing with cancers, contaminated aquifers, poisoned lands, and that legacy should be a warning to all of us today. Back here in Ontario, the most pressing nuclear issue for First Nations is the waste that will remain deadly for hundreds and thousands of years. Yet governments and the companies are still trying to figure out where to put it. The most high-profile case that I can think of was the Ontario Power Generation's proposal for the deep geologic repository right beside Lake Huron. For years, Saugeen Ojibwe Nation had said no, and in 2020, they held a referendum in their community with 86% voting against it, and without their consent, that project collapsed. Again, the Anishinaabe Nation here in Ontario and the Chiefs of Ontario, which represent more than nearly 200 First Nations, have both passed resolutions rejecting nuclear waste burial. And their stance is clear. Burying radioactive waste in the ground threatens the water, threatens our health, and it threatens our future generations. Yet today, we have the NMMO, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, continues to push forward with plans for a permanent repository with sites under consideration in Northern Ontario. Once again, Indigenous territories are being eyed as storage grounds for waste that no one else wants. There's also the issue of reactor expansion here in Ontario. We know that Ontario is investing heavily in refurbishing the Bruce and Darlington sites and now building the first grid-scale small modular reactor. But many First Nations have been questioning the long-term risks. We know that nuclear accidents may be rare, but they're not impossible. And if something went wrong on the Great Lakes, the consequences would be devastating for every community, First Nations or not. What I find especially troubling in the way that pro-nuclear advocates and politicians talk about Indigenous perspectives is they often cherry pick the few First Nations or organizations that express cautious openness, and they present that as if it represents the majority, or they conflate a community's willingness to consult with actual support. And simply put, we should understand that sitting at the table is not the same thing as saying yes. We've seen this tactic from the Doug Ford's Conservative government, but frankly, it's not just them. There are even some folks within the NDP who should know better, who are misrepresenting Indigenous positions on nuclear. When they do that, it tells me that they don't actually value First Nations input, because if they did, they would acknowledge the truth, which is the vast majority of First Nations, not only in Ontario, but across Canada, are opposed to nuclear waste storage and are deeply cautious about nuclear power. And there's another layer to this that needs to be addressed as well. Too often, pro-nuclear voices fall back on the paternalistic and frankly racist idea that First Nations don't really know what's best for themselves or the land, that if they can just be educated or convinced or given the right sales pitch, they'll eventually come around and say yes. But let's be clear. When hundreds of First Nations say no, they mean no. They are not confused. They are not uninformed. They are exercising sovereignty and protecting their lands and waters for future generations. Suggesting otherwise is disrespectful, it's dismissive, and it perpetuates the colonial attitudes that created these conflicts in the first place. And so, what does all of this tell us, you might ask? First, we know that fossil fuels and nuclear energy both carry enormous risks that Indigenous nations are forced to shoulder, risks to the land, to the water, to the health, and to our cultural survival. Second, the pattern is consistent. Governments and industries treat Indigenous territories as convenient sites for projects and waste while downplaying or twisting Indigenous opposition. We know that's not partnership, that's not true partnership, that's colonialism in a modern form. Third, if we are serious about climate change, climate action, energy justice, the answer cannot be to swap one harmful system for another. Replacing fossil fuels with nuclear doesn't solve the problem if it still imposes unacceptable risks to First Nations peoples. The real solutions, the ones that many First Nations are calling for today, are in renewable energy conservation and community-led projects that respect sovereignty and protects future generations, whether that be solar, wind, hydro, microgrids, energy efficiency. These can all reduce the reliance on fossil fuels without creating radioactive legacies that last longer than recorded human history. The bottom line is when we talk about nuclear or fossil fuels, we need to be honest about who carries the risk. For too long, these risks have been pushed onto Indigenous nations, while the benefits have flowed elsewhere, which is something to be very clear about. If we want a just energy transition, we have to listen to First Nations. Really listen and not cherry pick, not misrepresent, not dismiss. And when we do, the message will be clear. No project without consent, no projects that threatens waters, and no project that sacrifices the health for future generations. And with that, I say, Miigwech, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your tremendous insights and informing us of so many important things, and particularly highlighting the issue of storage, waste storage, because, well, we've been down that road, and it's a very critical issue for Ontario, for Indigenous communities. And so thank you. I'm sure there'll be some questions about that or comments later on. So very much appreciate your remarks tonight. And I'm very happy to bring on our next speaker. And I think everybody agrees with me that this is a tremendous panel, very insightful. And thank you so much for Cinema Politica, TERRE, and the Etobicoke-Lakeshore NDP for making this happen tonight. Our next panelist is Angela Bishkoff, and Angela is the director of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. And I love all those windmills and solar and behind you on your picture, Angela. You've worked in the environmental and nonprofit sector for more than 3 decades and in 4 Canadian cities, working on eco-cities, transportation, climate, mental health, and elections. Important, of course, to get good people in good places. And you are the director of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, which is a small but mighty group with your aim to move Ontario to a 100% renewable path. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And please let us know all the good things you have to tell us.
Thank you, Paula. And I'm going to share my slides. I hope this is it. That's not it, is it?
It was it, but it was all your screen, not just your
Oh, it
slide.
was it? Okay. What about this one? I'm gonna try something different. Okay, so you're seeing all the screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me try this. How's that?
Perfect.
That's great.
Okay. So I think there's going to be some repeat from the previous speakers, which is good. Repetition, is helpful, I guess, but surely I'll move quickly because I think there's going to be some repetition. But I'd like to thank TERRE and Cinema Politica and did you say Lakeshore West also for organizing this?
Ontario Lakeshore NDP.
Thank
That's
you.
right. That's right.
Yeah, thank you everybody for organizing and Paula for facilitating. So I work with the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. We were formed in 1997 to call for the coal phase out in Ontario. It took 17 years, but the community won out in the end. We then turned our attention to moving Ontario to 100% renewable energy future. And that would preclude any new investments in nuclear and gas. As Mark so clearly explained, this is a repeat slide, but essentially Doug Ford's electricity plan is about ramping up nuclear power and gas to support those nuclear builds. And as he said, we're looking at, these are huge, like the Wellesley project is proposed to be the largest nuclear project in the world. And this is, this whole rollout that Doug Ford is moving on is the largest nuclear build out in the world. So that's what we're dealing with here. Nuclear will rise from 50% to 75% of our electricity grid, while renewables will fall. That is Doug Ford's electricity plan. Renewables fall, nuclear rises. And of course, we're using Doug Ford's plan is to ramp up gas to back up all these large nuclear projects, which will take decades to roll out. And of course, gas is a very serious climate emitter. 75% of the gas we burn in Ontario comes from the United States. We're in the midst of a global climate crisis. Now is not the time to be ramping up gas. On the other hand, Hydro-Quebec is planning to meet 100% of its future electricity needs by investing in energy efficiency, renewables, and storage. Low-cost, clean energies. Why would Doug Ford bet on nuclear and gas? Well, who benefits from Ford's energy plan? It's 5 giant corporations that produce nuclear and gas power. They mine uranium, they run fossil pipelines. Consumers, taxpayers, and the environment lose. Oops. Why is it not moving? Sorry. Because, of course, renewables are a fraction of the cost of Ford's nuclear plus gas option. Nuclear is 8 times more expensive than onshore wind, 5 times more expensive than solar, and 3 times more expensive than offshore wind. It just makes no economic sense. But of course, we need storage. Renewables require storage, but there are many ways to store power, from stationary batteries to electric vehicle bidirectional batteries to coordination with Quebec, which can act like a giant battery to back up Ontario's intermittent wind and solar power. Nonetheless, on June 4th, the Ford government issued a news release saying that they're planning to build a 3rd line to bring nuclear power into Toronto from Pickering and Darlington. I mean, after all, OPG will need customers for its high-cost nuclear power. Previous governments have proposed a similar 3rd line to bring more power into Toronto, but they've always met with fierce opposition from Torontonians. We at the Clean Air Alliance, we would support a 3rd line, but only if it was to bring renewable offshore wind power from Lake Ontario. A study was done for the Ontario Power Authority, which showed that offshore wind power in the Great Lakes surrounding Ontario could meet 100% of Ontario's electricity needs. So what are we waiting for? Wind farms could be 10 kilometers offshore. You wouldn't even see them. The Audubon Society supports offshore wind because climate change is going to have more impacts to birds and other wildlife than wind turbines, and because wind and solar panels can coexist with wildlife. So it's time to lift the informal moratorium on offshore wind in Ontario. And likewise, low-cost clean solar power is there for the taking. Toronto could meet more than half of our electricity needs with solar on rooftops and parking lots. Toronto City Council wants renewables too. Twice, Toronto City Council voted no to expansion of the Portland's gas plant, but OPG and the Ford government continue to ignore their concerns. So last June, Toronto Council passed a motion calling on the IESO, the Independent Electricity System Operator, a provincial body, and Toronto Hydro to work together to develop a plan to phase out the polluting Portland's gas plant on the city's waterfront by 2035 and ramp up renewables and efficiency. Oops. The IESO and Toronto Hydro are now developing this 20-year plan. I can't get this bar. There we go. Are now developing this plan. It's called the Integrated Regional Resource Plan. And this is Toronto's chance to focus on building a modern, efficient, zero-carbon electricity system. We all in this webinar today, we need to build public support for the City of Toronto's request that this plan rapidly increase local renewable energy and storage like wind and solar, that they phase out the Portland's gas plant by 2035 or 2030 as TERRE is called for, And we need to reject the third line, bringing more nuclear power into the city. Ontario needs to rip up its contract with the US-based GE Hitachi company. Wind, water, solar, conservation, storage, all lower cost, cleaner options that won't rely on American fuel or American technology. We did a 1,200 person poll that showed us that Ontarians are behind canceling this contract. In fact, 85% of those polled want it canceled and replaced with renewables. The UN's IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is comprised of thousands of climate scientists around the world, they say we need to reduce global climate emissions in half by 2030. Solar and wind can help, as they take just 1 to 3 years to build. Nuclear reactors, on the other hand, take 10 to 15 or more years. And as in the case of Ontario, they're ramping up climate damaging gas plants as they build out those nukes. So if we believe that the climate is changing and fossil fuels are the primary cause, then we must transition rapidly to renewables. Unfortunately, the rest of the world is going renewable. Last year, 92.5% of all the new power that was added worldwide to the grids was from renewables, wind and solar. China itself is adding 1,000 megawatts of solar power every 8 hours. That's the equivalent of 1 nuclear reactor every 8 hours. And then the fuel after that is free. No mining, no radioactive waste. Oh, my slide's not moving. Sorry. So our neighbors, Manitoba and Quebec, they have the lowest electricity rates in Canada because they're primarily powered with water power. Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador, they have huge untapped wind power potential. If we want to reduce our dependence on dirty imported American gas and high cost, high risk, polluting American nuclear technology, we should work with our fellow provinces to create an east-west renewable electricity system that makes the most of our strengths right here in Canada. Please check out our website, cleanairalliance.org, or reach out to me with any questions that you have. I'm going to pop a link in the chat bar. You can send your own letter to Toronto MPPs, including Peter, asking them where they stand on nuclear versus renewables, and together let's support City Council's plan for a renewable future. Let's work together. Thank you to everybody for listening and your support.
Thank you so much, Angela, for that really great presentation and bringing it all home to here in Toronto. And some of the notes in our chat are great, and you're getting thanked for your work and dedication in our chat, as you might see. So it's really great to have you here tonight, and I'm sure there'll be follow-up questions and comments that you'll be able to add to this fantastic seminar that's being put on tonight. I'm going to take us to our last panelist, who basically needs no introduction, but I'm going to do that anyway, Peter, because you've been our member of parliament. You were reelected in February 27, 2025, when we had the snap election, and you easily and handily won that, and you've represented our community for many years so well. You always bring your fresh ideas to Queen's Park on creating jobs while fighting climate change and keeping people safe from toxins, affordable housing, public transit funding, and integrating new Canadians into our economy. But you are a climate champion, and you are the opposition shadow minister for the environment, conservation, and parks, and shadow minister for emergency preparedness and response. But you are well known for your climate action. You were partner with Jack Layton on all of his many initiatives. Even as a city councilor, you did that. You worked for Greenpeace. You have a tremendous record, and we're very happy that you're able to share your thoughts here tonight in this really amazing webinar. Peter Tabbins.
Okay. Paula, thanks very much. That was a very kind introduction. And good evening, everyone. It's really good to see you. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces and names of people I've been talking to the last few months. It's nice to see you here live and on screen. Everyone is here tonight because they know Ontario needs a new energy plan, new energy policy. And I think everyone in this event knows that Doug Ford's approach is a huge problem for our Ontario. We need a lot more electricity in Ontario. That's absolutely the case. We're talking about very big money to do this. We're talking in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think, Mark Winfield, you alluded to that in your presentation. We are talking amounts of money that will change this province and shape its destiny for decades to come. It'll affect our standard of living, our cost of electricity, our ability to attract investment and create jobs. And we need more electricity because we need to move away from coal, oil, and gas if we want to protect ourselves from climate change. We need to move away from those fuels if we want to control our energy costs. And if we don't control our energy costs, we won't be competitive on the world stage in terms of production and attracting investments. I want to say as well, we need public power to ensure the electricity system serves us, not corporate interests. And Ford's plan won't do any of that for us. His plan doesn't quickly cut pollution from burning coal, oil, and gas. It's not a plan to fight climate change. And frankly, I went through his plan again today. The words climate change do not show up once. It's not a plan to cut energy costs, notwithstanding the way he bills it. It will put pressure on household budgets and on the cost of doing business in Ontario. His plan aims to substantially increase nuclear power in Ontario, and that poses big risks for affordability. At the same time, and other panelists noted this, renewable power will become a much smaller part of our energy mix. Globally, installations of renewable power are dominating the energy scene because the cost of renewable energy is dropping steadily while the price of nuclear power has been rising. Last year, globally, 4 times more renewable power was installed than nuclear power, according to the International Energy Agency. Low-cost renewables are reshaping global energy trends. Ford's plan to expand gas use for making electricity and for heating our homes and businesses makes no climate sense. And because of the risk of much higher gas costs, it means that we are risking much higher household bills and higher electricity prices. On top of all this concern about costs and failures to cut climate pollution, we have a government that is chaining us to American supplies of nuclear fuel in the future by committing to build American-designed small modular reactors. And whether you like nuclear power or not, you have to admit that increasing our dependence on American technology and fuel supplies makes no sense in the world today. As you're all aware, the Ford government is not a government driven by thoughtful planning. And I think that is a very gentle thing to say. It's a government driven by showing favor to friends and supporters in the corporate sector. So let's talk about gas in a little more detail. Enbridge is the major energy player in Ontario. They supply most of the gas to homes and businesses. And by the way, more than half the gas we use for heating our homes in this province comes from the United States. Enbridge has a very close relationship with the Ford government. In 2023, when the provincial energy regulator did something that had rarely been done before, and that was stood up for consumers on issues around gas supply, the Ford government stepped in and overturned that decision. They even rewrote the law around regulation so that the Ford government could more effectively protect the gas company, Enbridge, against consumer interest. It's very clear that when it comes to the politics of gas, Ford has a very strong connection to the industry, and that strong connection shapes the energy plan before us, not a thoughtful consideration of what it takes to build an energy system that will serve us in the 21st century. And of course, his commitment to gas, predominantly gas sourced from the United States, contradicts any commitment to affordable energy or to economic independence from Trump's America. If you want to make a strong declaration of independence from America, then committing to move away quickly from natural gas would be one of the most effective statements you could make. The plan he has put before the people of this province explicitly outlines a path for the continued expansion of natural gas for home heating, economic development, and managing peak electricity demand. That spells more global heating. You can be sure that when it comes to energy use, the politics with Ford are the politics of protecting the gas interests. Now, going over to nuclear energy, there are a lot of different dimensions to the politics here. And I think, as was said at the beginning, it's very hard to fit everything into a few minutes. And every panelist who's spoken probably could have gone on for an hour or so without any difficulty. But the political reality is the political power of Bruce Nuclear and the construction companies that want to work in nuclear should leave us unsurprised at the political muscle of that industry when it comes to shaping Ford's vision of the energy future. We have not had a plan put before us that shows the numbers justifying this investment or that investment. We haven't had a plan put before us that will go to a hearing where witnesses will be challenged, where evidence will be tested, where we'll actually get a chance to look under the hood and see what's going on. That's true with the gas portion of the plan, and it's true with the nuclear portion of the plan. People have remarked on this before, and I'm going to go back to it. It is very strange that there's this commitment to American-designed and fueled small modular reactors. The province's body that runs the electricity system, the Independent Electricity System Operator, released figures showing that expected power costs from the SMRs, the small modular reactor, the power cost would be higher than the expected power costs from more conventional nuclear sources. And interestingly, when the American outfit, GE Hitachi, was first promoting small modular reactors around 2019, they were claiming that the reactors would cost $1 billion per reactor. Now, many of you may know, maybe all of you know, that the current estimated price for the first one of these reactors is $6 billion. Now, that's quite a price jump, even before construction has started. The uranium fuel needed to run these reactors is not made in Canada. And frankly, the cost to set up the system to make that fuel would be extraordinarily expensive. We are not going to do it. So if we build these reactors, there are two big fuel suppliers that we're going to have to rely on. One is the United States and one is Russia. And I don't count either of these as reliable suppliers. The politics around investing heavily in technology that is more expensive and ties us more closely to Trump's America makes no sense to me. People should keep in mind that Ford's plans for expanding generation are not ones that appear to include expansion of public ownership, not with nuclear and not with other technologies. The expansion of nuclear reactors at the Bruce plant is simply going to be an expansion of privately owned power. And when it comes to the plant proposed for the Port Hope area, there is no commitment to public power in their plan. One thing that I want to note, and others haven't touched on this, but it's very important in terms of our relationship to the United States and the way Ford is portraying himself. A part of the plan that doesn't get much upfront coverage is Ford's call for closer integration with the American energy system under the umbrella of his Fortress AMCAN energy plan that will have us tying ourselves far more closely to American technology and energy markets. I believe we need more independence from America, not less. And the people of Ontario are pretty clear about this. As we've heard tonight, Ontario desperately needs a new energy policy. At least 25 years of privatization, drift, confusion by previous Liberal and Conservative provincial governments has created a crisis, one that we're all going to have to work together to solve. And the challenges are huge. I'm going to list a number, but there are many more. The need to work with First Nations to ensure free, prior, and informed consent for any developments on their traditional lands. The urgent demand to respond as quickly as possible to the climate crisis. The challenge of affordability. The best way to create and maintain well-paid unionized jobs. The management of nuclear waste. The demand for a publicly owned and operated electrical system. Our need to manage and maintain the current energy system in Ontario as we plan for the future. And the need to ensure, at a time when Trump is threatening the future of Canada, that any economic benefit from investing in electrical generation and transmission stays in Canada for Canadians. Our own political party, the NDP, is involved in debating these issues right now, and we'll be considering a resolution at our party convention this weekend to establish a path forward on energy. This is a joint resolution that's been reached after discussions with a variety of actors within our party. I support this joint resolution, and I hope others within the party will do the same. With that, Paula, thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. We can see why you're the energy critic, so very strong and knowledgeable. Very much appreciated. I can see in the chat, people are very impressed. I think I'm just going to take a number. I don't know if we get all the panelists up on the screen there, Susan, it would be good. Just going through some of the chat issues. I just wonder if we could look at this energy discussion. What would a good public process look like in Ontario? Because Peter, you've mentioned that there is no conversation, there is no hearings that might normally be. What would that look like in Ontario as far as a public consultation on the direction for energy? What has it looked like before? What would be a good one?
Sorry, Paula, you were directing that to me?
Yes, or a comment to you or any comment, but
Well, if I could speak very quickly then, we have had hearings in the past in Ontario, demand supply hearings. And let's face it, all processes are imperfect. But at the very least, provincial governments should be required to put forward plans that show the costs, the expected benefits, the evidence that they're basing that on. And there should be public hearings so that people can challenge that evidence. And that has happened before in Ontario. And unfortunately, the Liberals, when they were in power after Mike Harris, took a meat axe to that planning process. And Mike Harris had been no great champion of it. And Doug Ford is really continuing the process of making sure that what we get is a public relations publication of his energy plan. And no hearings, no ability for us to actually find out what's going on, much less than we would get even for a hearing on a rate increase for Toronto Hydro. I mean, it's crazy.
Thank you, because there are rate increase hearings. The OEB has hearings. We've been to lots of hearings, but of course, there's nothing here. I think one of the issues here is talking about timing and having something happen very quickly. I think how rapid is this? We're looking at just looking at their plan for $400 billion spend. That's, I think, over a very long period of time. You simply can't do all of that within a couple of years compared to how quickly you could have a renewable program or solar or anything else. So, or battery storage. I think that correct me if I'm wrong, but there's this notion that we're just going to build everything very fast, including anything going on to change the Portland's Energy Center, which I can't see is going to happen very quickly either to deliver that nuclear power to the Portland's Energy Center. Can you comment on that, please, members of the panel? How fast can you spend $400 billion? How long does it take you to spend that?
How long does it take you to find $400 billion to start with?
Well, they might just borrow it and then put it on the deficit, but so it really is, it's a very big spend. And
yeah, it has implications for the province's fiscal position. I think what's termed time to power question is a very relevant one in the sense of how long does it take to deliver. And on nuclear is probably the slowest and the least reliable, given the track record both here and in Europe and in the United States. You probably want to focus on the things that deploy much more quickly. That tends to mean conservation, demand management, energy productivity improvements first. They tend to be the fastest to deploy. Renewables generally are very reliable and very fast in terms of timelines and cost. Storage has also come through very well of late, again, in terms of time to construction and cost. It's also relatively flexible and scalable, which is really important here. because one of the big factors here is very, very high levels of uncertainty about where things are actually going in multiple fronts. So you want to be, I think, very cautious about things that lock you into assumptions about where we'll be 15 or 20 years from now, which are almost certainly wrong. And that has been the track record in the past. Ontario Hydro made enormous projections about power needs, which then turned out to be wrong and effectively bankrupted itself. You want things that are scalable, that deploy relatively quickly, whose impacts and risks are well understood, that don't require extraordinary financing mechanisms in order to be able to deploy. And that gives you the space to make corrections as you go in response to what actually happens as opposed to what you might think happened. So I think that's the bottom line. I think, nuclear clearly fails by that standard, given what we know about both our own record and the record in other places. And we're seeing other technologies being deployed on budget and on time on much shorter time scales. And again, I'd emphasize the conservation demand management side is almost always the most cost-effective and fastest to deploy option.
Thank you. Anybody else want to just talk about the notion of this is a fast way to go to spend 400 billion? And we all know 400 billion will be 600, 500 for just watching our transit being built and increasing exponentially, more dollars being put in. Peter, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well,
Timing-wise?
if I could, Paula, because the plan that's been put before us shows the nuclear power being spent or set up over the next 10, 15 to 20 years. And is being marketed as a zero emission technology. And one of the participants has been asking this question, why aren't we focused on fossil fuels? And we do need to be focused on cutting our emissions. We need to cut our emissions by about between 7 and 10% per year to stabilize the climate. And that means that we need to be investing today, and Angela actually had some pretty good slides there, to cut our emissions very, very rapidly. And the fastest way to do that, and the other economies in the world recognize this, is to use renewable technologies. Jack Layton and I worked together on doing the federal NDP's climate plan in the early 2000s. And we looked at what the options were. And if you wanted to go fast, and if you wanted to go affordably, you didn't go nuclear. And that's the reality. If you want to take on climate change, you don't wait 20 years. Canada's on fire. The world's on fire. If your house is on fire, you don't say, I'm going to wait a few weeks for the fire truck to come. No, you want action now. And I think we're in the same position with climate change and the need to push very quickly for investment in renewable energy to cut those emissions pronto.
Thank you. Anybody else? Before I go to the question of storage, because I think Michael raised such an important question. We think about the power coming in and won't that be great and all these megawatts and etc. But the fact is, where do you store the waste and what's the plan for that? I've heard nothing about that. And really and truly, it is a number one issue for First Nations, but it should just be a number one issue for everybody. And I'm not sure what his board's plan is. We know his plan is to spend in all those locations, but what about the waste? Who wants to weigh in on that? Who wants to start?
Well, this does take us into new territory in a number of ways. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization's original focus and mandate was to deal with the waste from the existing reactor fleet to its end of life. And indeed, Madame Dowdswell, when she was head of NWMO, actually raised questions even at the point where we began to talk about refurbishments, and pointed out she, at the time, before being lieutenant governor, was head of the NWMO, and raised the question that nobody talked to them about what the implications of life extensions on nuclear reactors were for the waste. what we're doing here is taking that into a whole other realm, because if nothing else, the waste from CANDU reactors are about as well characterized as anything ever will be. We know what we're dealing with, and we have some reasonable understanding of how it's likely to behave. Given that everything we're seeing says we're moving to non-CANDU designs, indeed, as we've talked about, requiring enriched fuel, this introduces completely different waste streams, which are not well characterized at all, or even not understood at this stage. I was actually involved in some research trying to understand what comes out the back end of the SMRs, and it's not clear at all. And indeed, in some cases, with some of the designs, very serious questions have been raised about whether they would put us on the wrong side of the Nuclear Weapons Non-Proliferation Treaty, given some of the isotopes that might be in some of the waste streams. This was outside of NWMO's original planning framework. They have sort of put their hand up and said, oh, we'll take anything, sight unseen. I think this is, again, an issue for the potential host community. At the moment, the waste fuel from the CANDUs, and there's about 3 million plus waste fuel bundles sitting in storage, most of them in giant swimming pools at Darlington and Pickering, but also in dry storage at Bruce. It's this question of, they've been looking for a site. They claim they found a site in northwestern Ontario near Ignace. There's all kinds of contestation about consent, both from the community and certainly from the affected First Nations. As Michael said, yeah, we're prepared to talk. That does not mean consent. This is something quite different. So that's kind of where we're at. I mean, the estimated costs on MWMOs, even if it works, are in the range of $24 billion. And keeping in mind this stuff, if we were to decide burial is the best option, and there's debates about that. If we decide that's what we're actually going to do, because keep in mind the NWMO's position, the view has been that this material has to be isolated from human and environmental contact on a time scale of 1 million years. And I was saying to my class today, you turn that around and go backwards, we weren't Homo sapiens 1 million years ago.
Thank you.
We were about Homo erectus level. So there we are. So that's an enormous and unsolved problem.
Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on that, Ignace, and what that process is looking like now? Angela.
I'm interested in hearing Michael's perspective, of course, but I just want to say, the nuclear industry for 6 decades is saying they would solve the waste problem. And this many decades later, all they've come up with is burying it in a hole and covering it up and hoping it doesn't leak anytime soon. And they call that a DGR, a deep geologic repository. There's no DGR anywhere in existence that is currently housing high-level nuclear fuel waste. There are 3 DGRs in the world that are currently housing nuclear waste, but it's intermediate, so it's not nuclear fuel waste. And all 3 have failed. Yet the industry is still claiming they know how to do this, and they're going to ship it all to Northern Ontario and bury it in a deep hole and hope it doesn't waste. One of those 3 DGRs in Germany, they're actually going in and pulling up the waste that was there at a cost of billions of dollars. Like, this is such an experiment, and like maybe they'll never figure it out. What we're calling for as an NGO is, until we have a real acceptable solution, we should be taking all the waste that Mark mentioned out of those pools and put them in much safer dry storage above ground, attack resistant, reinforced concrete vaults, pull it away from the waterfront, and because we know how to hold it there temporarily, and we can do that. but much safer than it is right now. There is that waste is not safe. There's as much plutonium in all the waste at Pickering, just the waste, plutonium in the waste that has, would have to be pulled out. But there's enough plutonium, there's more plutonium there than all the nuclear weapons in the world right now. Like, this is the nastiest stuff we've ever created. And so, like, and at the very least, we have to stop producing more, at the very least.
Thank you. And Michael, you're the one who raised the nuclear waste issue and the chiefs saying just because we're talking to you doesn't mean we're saying yes. So how can non-Indigenous folks here in Toronto support those chiefs in Northern Ontario and the individuals and bands in Northern Ontario that are quite concerned about a bunch of waste turning up, courtesy of Doug Ford?
One of the most meaningful ways non-Indigenous communities can support Indigenous nations, especially in the North, is by standing with them when they say no. Too often, we see the governments and companies try and isolate Indigenous opposition, but when neighboring municipalities and unions, churches, ordinary citizens back up those positions, it gets harder to ignore. Second, people can just simply educate themselves about the treaties. This is where it all goes back to, about UNDRIP, about the history of projects like uranium mining and nuclear waste storage. That way, Indigenous communities aren't carrying the burden of always having to explain why they're concerned. And third, it's about pushing your own leaders, right? So here in Toronto, provincially, federally, if you live in Ontario, for example, you can hold Doug Ford's government accountable, even your local MPP accountable, when they misrepresent First Nations positions on nuclear. The pressure matters. And it's about showing up for the positive, right? Indigenous communities aren't just saying no. Indigenous communities aren't anti-development. Many communities are leading in renewable energy. You look in the Northern Ontario, there's many communities investing in solar. In the prairies, there's a lot of wind activity going on. You look, there's a lot of stuff happening with in coastal communities as well. Non-Indigenous allies can support by amplifying those stories, investing in those projects, supporting those projects, and demanding more support for them by the government.
Thank you. Someone asked earlier if there's any health study impacts from northern Saskatchewan on uranium. I don't know if anybody knows of any, but that was one of the questions because you may or may not. If you don't, somebody will know within it. Nope, we don't know about those health studies. Thank you. I just want to go into something that you had said, Peter, and that is or I think it was you, Angela, just the corporate approach here, the 5 companies that will be bidding or running the industry, that it will be a P3 model, which we know 400 billion turns into much more. So is this a new era, perhaps, that Ford wants to or is trying to bring in, where there's no public hearings on anything, where instead of a public hydro system that's being managed and built under government guidance, we have a P3 model, and then these corporations are somehow that aren't necessarily all stellar energy corporations somehow have a foothold and into the industry, including building the $400 billion worth of nuclear plants that they want. So this funding model of P3, of private and corporate, it does appear to be extremely concerning, as much as where the waste would go, or telling people that it's going to be rapid when 20 years isn't rapid, and we know everything that gets built takes much longer than what we say it's going to take. So somebody just comment on that brand new model.
Well, I think others will have comments on this as well, but I don't think it's any surprise to people that corporations in Ontario are incredibly powerful, and particularly with the Ford government, they get to write the script for what's going to be said and how it's going to be said and what's going to be done. I wish I could say this was a new world that we're encountering, but unfortunately, it's a world we've been fighting for quite a while now. It was certainly a world we were fighting under Mike Harris when he brought in the, what can I say, not stellar company Enron to help design the energy market system in Ontario. So we are fighting a situation in which the primary interest on the part of the government is making sure that the corporations do well financially, rather than the primary interest being to make sure that the people of Ontario do well economically in terms of standard of living, health conditions, and taking on climate. I think what we have, Paula, is one of those shapeshifter situations where the problem has been for a long time the outsized power of corporations to determine what our future is going to be. And it just keeps coming up with a new formulation and a new look. But the promotion of gas, the promotion of gas-fired electricity, the expansion of gas burning to heat our homes and our businesses, that's something that Ford's going to be very happy with. And companies that build large mega projects like new nuclear power plants are also going to be pushing to have the province do exactly just that. We shouldn't see it as completely new. We should see it as the problem we've been dealing with now for decades, and one that we need to fight successfully.
Thanks. Has there ever been such a $400 billion price tag that's been, this is a giveaway in that sense of planning for such a spend of this nature, but perhaps that's happened in the past.
Well, it's in some ways a repeat of the original nuclear construction program that Ontario Hydro ran from the 1960s to the 1990s, the end of which, of course, Ontario Hydro effectively bankrupted itself. And in many ways, we're still dealing with the fallout from that. I would emphasize, though, that, renewable projects, energy efficiency projects, energy storage projects do come in on time and on budget very consistently, do not require extraordinary public financing or absorption of debt or risk. So I'd keep that in mind, there are projects we can build that are built on time and on budget and actually work the way they're supposed to. But I'd also put a pin in the thought too about the big winners here are the big engineering companies, because on these projects, they don't lose money no matter what happens, because we end up having to still pay them to finish even when the project makes no sense. I mean, we went through that with Darlington in the 1980s when the Peterson government was faced with the decision whether to finish building the thing or not. So I don't lose track of that thought or the influence of those types of actors who are really, really keen on very, very big infrastructure projects, because they do tend to be the big winners no matter what.
Thank you. There's been a couple of questions and discussion about why can't we plug into Manitoba and Quebec that are far more sustainable energy-wise and aren't relying on nuclear power. So I'm not sure who knows why we can't do that. Angela, do you want to comment on that, please?
The federal government has offered money to Ontario to expand our grid connections with Quebec and Manitoba. And Ontario consistently, with the previous liberal governments and now the Ford government, consistently has refused to expand those connections because we're protecting our incumbent nuclear industries, our nuclear and gas industry. We're protecting our like there's a lot of workers and it's a huge industry for Ontario, and Quebec has massive surplus generation capacity as well as storage And we have been, the previous Liberal government did do an exchange, and this government as well is doing an exchange. It's relatively small amount. But the IESO has done the studies. We could be expanding our grid for really low cost. There's no opposition in Quebec. I saw some people questioning the First Nations won't like it. Yes, they love it. The more they export from Quebec into Ontario, the more they earn because of precedent-setting agreements. And so the only resistance is Ontario protecting its local industries.
Anybody else to comment? Because really, when we're talking about interprovincial, as we are under tariffs, and we should be moving away from the US, where we have the gas, move to an interprovincial approach, this would make sense to be a very big interprovincial approach, much cheaper than $400 billion.
Yeah, the Quebec Eastern relationship, I think, is the more interesting one. With Manitoba, the distances are so large. In the more logical relationship for Manitoba, if we're looking at a national climate kind of perspective, is with Saskatchewan. Because if you're going to decarbonize Saskatchewan's grid, which is very, very keen on coal at the moment, with Mr. Moe, all the modeling I've seen says you're going to need storage, and the obvious place for the storage to come from is Manitoba. The relationship east is more complicated. There's some very interesting conversations going on among the Maritimes and Quebec in terms of what might happen there. Quebec is a bit of an enigma at the moment. We actually did a webinar last year on what's going on there. And where things are heading is an interesting question. They're certainly adding lots of capacity. Whether what they think they were going to use that capacity for is going to play out, I think is a good question at this stage. So there are some complications. I do worry in some ways. We missed the boat with Quebec because Mr. Legault repeatedly made offers to Mr. Ford and was ignored. And so to a certain degree, Quebec sort of turned back inwards, although I think there may be some room for conversations there.
Thank you.
But we need,
Yeah.
We've not played that card the way we could have.
So really and truly, there's been a few questions about communications. And just on this last discussion, I don't know who may have done that costing of the cost of power, let's say coming from Quebec, how many megawatts would be able to come in over what period of time versus a 400 billion over 20 years, which is about, I guess if my math's right, about 20 billion a year. So do you want to just comment on, and I know you have the Clean Air Alliance, how do you break through, and where's the communications where all the great things that you've told us tonight and the important issues, the spending, the waste, the P3 model, the fact that there is surplus power, that's clean power that could come across the border into Ontario. How does that break through when you're having more and more folks that are saying that, oh, this is a great idea to spend $400 billion, nuclear's clean, nuclear's all of these different things, because it's permeating pretty deeply even among progressive people that somehow this is a good plan. So I'm really interested in your thoughts here of how to crack that a little bit and what we think we need to do. And then we'll wrap up shortly. But I think that's the real challenge, because everything you've told us tonight, I wish everybody could get a copy of all your slides and everything that you've had to say here. The other thing is, Mark, everybody would like your slides. Angela, they'd like your slides just separately. I know that the team will send this out. You can edit a lot of my comments out and just get straight to the goods of facts. But I think it's a great webinar with so much good information. So any thoughts on just how to push this a bit more using what you showed us tonight, talked about tonight? I'm just going to ask everybody. Peter,
I
what do
think
you
the
think?
central question is of cost. In the current environment, the question is cost. I mean, if we're putting new build reactors into the grid at 30 to 40 cents per kilowatt hour, which is the sort of ballpark we're looking at for a new build based on Vogel, based on what we saw from Tennessee Valley Authority on SMRs. That's going to push electricity costs through the roof. That's going to affect affordability profoundly. It's going to affect our competitiveness profoundly. And what happens then, I'm not entirely sure. You may see large scale grid defection, which then will magnify the economic problems of how to pay for this, because those who can self-generate will. So I would emphasize that more than anything else is how the heck is this going to be paid for, and how does it stack up against the alternatives? Even in a decarbonization context, we've seen work from TAF. I think there's more work coming down the pipe, looking at what do the decarbonization scenarios look like for Ontario that are not the one the government seems to be pursuing, which isn't a decarbonization scenario anyway, and where do they come out on cost? Because I don't think, there will be a limit. We're already probably at the limit, the extent to which the government can subsidize electricity costs out of general expenditures, which is what it's been doing. So how this plays out in terms of energy costs and what the economic consequences of that, I think, are a very important question.
Thanks, Mark. That's a really important point. People already
Yeah.
feel the pressure around energy costs, that this will exacerbate that dramatically. Peter, did you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, I think Mark has nailed it. We are looking at very substantial increases in our hydro rates. It's not just that we'll have a lot more to spend on nuclear. If we build a lot more gas plants, if we are hit with the impact of liquefied natural gas being shipped overseas, so we start paying the world price for gas rather than the relatively insulated North American price, people are going to get hit hard. And I think making it clear to people where those higher bills are coming from is going to be critical to shifting direction on what we invest in. Renewables are really cheap, and we need to get that story out to people that if they want to have hydro bills they can afford, they need to have a technology in place that provides them with those lower cost energy bills.
Yeah, affordability is a #1 issue for everybody. And if this is driving those costs and uncontrollably, I think that's an important thing. Michael, do you want to weigh in? I'm going to get everybody to have a word here.
I think we have to cut through the greenwashing of nuclear energy. I think nuclear gets framed as clean because it doesn't emit carbon at the point of generation. But we have to remind people the nuclear cycle includes uranium mining, radioactive waste that lasts hundreds of thousands of years, and it has a risk of accidents, and that doesn't seem too clean or green to me. We need to also make clear that time is critical, right? As said previously, we cannot be waiting 10 decades to build new plants and whatnot. We need the energy now. And that goes into the costs that everyone has mentioned. And we have to remind people it's not a technical debate, as I touched on at the opening of my segment. This is about justice and sovereignty, right? And so, like I said, conservatives and progressives alike tend to cherry pick and misrepresent Indigenous views on this issue, and we need to be clear about how First Nations feel about nuclear energy and the alternatives that are out there, the renewable alternatives. So we know it's too risky, it's too slow, and it disrespects Indigenous views and rights. And so that's something that we need to make clear as we communicate forward about this issue.
Thank you very much. Angela, last word.
Yeah, everybody's said what I need to say, really. But like personally, I'm really motivated, and probably lots of people on this call are super motivated by environmental concerns and potential accidents and First Nation solidarity and the waste and intergenerational injustice of leaving behind radioactive waste for 1,000,000 years. Like, it's just incomprehensible. And the fact that we're delaying our climate response because we're building out over decades more nuclear reactors, that motivates me. But across the political spectrum, and I think strategically, our focus should be on the cost, as Peter and Mark are saying. That's how we win conservatives and liberals and everybody across the whole political spectrum. You can't debate the renewables are a fraction of the costs of nuclear and a fraction of the emissions of gas. And so we're going to win. We just have to speed it up.
We have to speed up our own communications, is what you're saying. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was really amazing information. You're getting lots of clapping that's going up the screen for everybody's contributions tonight, which were very effective, very informative. Look at it all, the hearts, thumbs up, claps, everything. It's really great. Thank you so much to the panel. Thank you to those who've organized it. Thank you to everybody who stayed. I know I'm going to call on you, Corey, from TERRE, to wrap up, give us a wrap up, including upcoming actions.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. Just, reiterating the thank you to everyone here, to our amazing panelists, Angela, Mark, Michael, and Peter, for sharing your wisdom and insights on this very important topic. Thank you to Paula for doing a wonderful job facilitating. And also thank you to Cinema Politica Danforth, Toronto-Danforth Riding Association, and Etobicoke-Lakeshore NDP for organizing this evening and for inviting TERRE to co-host. And thanks to all of you, the participants, for being here and caring about this topic. We hope you'll leave with some new information and ideas on how you can get involved and take action to stand up for a renewable energy future for Ontario. And I'm going to leave you with one suggestion. One way you can make your voice heard is to attend the Draw the Line March and Rally this Saturday, September 20th. Around the world, communities are mobilizing to demand that governments pick a side and a just and safe future for all of us. So in Toronto, the event starts at 2 p.m. At Yonge and Dundas with a rally, and TERRE is organizing a group of East End residents where you're welcome to join us. Supporters and allies, we're meeting at Broadview Station at 1:15, and we hope to see you there. So come on out on Saturday to really draw the line against climate injustice and make your voice heard for a renewable energy future for Ontario. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Corey.
Thank you, Corey.